I think you hear a lot from certainly right-wing elements in the United States and Europe about how important ethnic homogeneity is, or at least, you let through generations, you let assimilation happen or what have you. Well, I mean, the Somalis are 90 to 98%, depends on what the measure is Somali. And that is not helped them.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am the producer, Rory McElhone, and joined with the man that will be dissecting the world of politics today is Robert Morris. How are you?
Not bad. I had a fun weekend. It was a holiday weekend, and I had some friends in town who had 2 kids. So I did some babysitting, which is not really
how did you find that?
I was kind of amazed by the parents in this family of 4 are like adamantly against screens, which I find that a lot of parents of 1 child can pull that off, but usually parents of 2 kids just sort of like give up and hand them iPads. But these guys, I mean, I guess they're both sort of have an athletic history, and they've committed to it, and it was really honestly the most pleasant 3 and 6-year-old I've ever dealt with. Like, I babysat them for a couple hours, and like, we watched the movie, and then they were like, well, I guess it's time for us to go to bed. And they tucked themselves in. It was amazing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
It's like the Flanderses' children.
I guess.
And you're saying iPads turn children into the Simpsons children?
Quite possible.
Apparently, it's bad for their developing long-range vision, because they're looking at everything so close, which is
not
interesting.
Surprising.
Found it humorous this week. Trump got booed by the Libertarian Party. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did see that. That was somewhat satisfying. I don't usually watch video clips, but when someone described that, I was like, I think I watched the entirety of it. It was pretty.
Did it make you proud of your old libertarian roots?
It did. Yeah, and kind of. I think Mike Lee, the Utah senator, came up and was very pissy, which. But because he was like, oh, you should vote for Trump, which is, so that was satisfying.
Is there anything in particular they really dislike about Trump, or is it just the fact he's a politician and believes in some laws?
Well, I think if you're a principled libertarian, you can see that he failed to meet any of the promises that he had made.
Yeah, but he forgot the promises. That's not his fault.
Well, there you go. There's very little, Rory, to inspire confidence or affection in today's Libertarian Party. So it's nice to see them to see them do that. They've gone in crankier and crankier directions in recent years. So it's, I guess, kind of nice to see something that you could feel a little bit good about.
So you're ready to talk about today's topic, which is a country where a lot of hope and optimism goes to die?
Yeah, I'm impressed. I don't know where you've seen hope or optimism about Somalia, Rory, over the past 30 years, but there has not been much.
There was that invasion. It was going to go so well.
Yeah, indeed. So you you mentioned libertarians. I think Somalia is often mentioned as the counter to any libertarian view. Well, if you don't like government, you should go to Somalia. And I think actually that's a bit ridiculous. And actually, I hadn't really thought about that. Actually, it was a mostly communist government in Somalia before the chaos. So actually, maybe it confirms some libertarian.
Even though the communists didn't quite support them when it came to the crunch, because they thought it was a terrible idea. But we'll come to that later on.
We'll come to that. I think regardless, it is a ridiculous argument, and Somalia has very, very little to do with U.S. political approaches. So today we are I've got a lot of notes. I don't even know if we're going to be able to make our way all the way through them.
Oh my goodness.
But I would like to discuss the history of Somalia. Last week we went in detail on Dirty Wars, a book by Jeremy Scahill, and a lot of that book talks about the collapse of Somalia, the second or third collapse of Somalia, and it really allowed me to sort of dive in on the details of how poorly the United States has served that very, very disintegrated country. I'm not actually so angry about the Black Hawk Down era. In fact, I think the Bush administration the first Bush administration, let me clarify,
Senior.
The guy in the 1990s, the Dimbol's father. I'm not very angry, actually, about his attempts to handle Somalia, whereas I'm very angry about the Bush sons. attempts and from 2006 on. But I thought it actually might be worthwhile, and I spent the morning doing the research. So let's try and do like all of Somalia history.
Okay.
We're obviously not going to go back into...
Are you going to go thousands of years ago? No.
No, we're not going back into biblical
Well, it
times.
was used by the Romans as like a landing post for the spice trade to get to India and stuff.
100%. And that is a key element to understand with the Horn of Africa, is that unlike most of Africa, it has been really tightly interweaved with Islamic civilizations, Roman civilizations.
Are they one of the first Muslim civilizations?
Absolutely. Somalia is right over the Gulf of Aden from the Arabian Peninsula. So yeah, you've got mosques.
And if you're talking so far back, then Djibouti would still be part of Somalia, wouldn't it?
Well, and you see, that's an interesting question, and I think we're probably going to get into some national questions here that might actually irritate Somalis. But I think where I want to start is kind of in the period before European colonization. But I think it's just important to emphasize, just how deep the antagonism between Ethiopia and Somalia is. Because Somalia has that, or Somalis, the Somali people more broadly, has that incredibly long connection to Islam, and Ethiopia has an even longer connection to Christianity. And I think possibly, I haven't looked into this in detail, but I kind of assume that like the part of the ethnogenesis of separate Ethiopian and Somali peoples has something to do with the fact that Somalis are Muslim and Ethiopians are Christian. And it is, to be distinct from that is not, there are many, 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 many Muslim Ethiopians, like of the country of Ethiopia. But in historic terms, the ethnic groups that run the Ethiopian empire are more traditionally Christian. Somalis are more traditionally Muslim.
But there's quite a lot of Somalis would also be in Ethiopia as well, wouldn't there?
Oh, yes. We will get to that at great length. I assure you. So it's got this long history. It's on the Horn of Africa, interacting with Rome, interacting with the Ottomans, going as far afield as India.
Well, it's not that far from India, to be fair.
I wouldn't
want to swim it, but...
Yeah, nor I. So this long history of interaction that Ethiopia also has to a degree as well. And I am never one who wants to talk about endless enmity and, I think that's all of these. If there's a war, if there's a conflict between a people or a religion or this, that, and the other thing, it's because the politicians of that time thought it was useful. But a very useful cleavage for politicians that want to use conflict to get power is the cleavage between Ethiopians and Somalis. And as you had mentioned, that this makes it quite an uncomfortable fact that the second or third largest ethnic group, or third or fourth largest ethnic group in Ethiopia is in fact Somali.
6.2% Somali.
There have been multiple wars over this. Something I found really interesting, just as an indicator of how far back the Ethiopian and Somali interaction with outsiders goes. And I'm not asserting this is the first example of this or anywhere near the last, certainly not the last, but just in part of my research, there was the Sultanate of Adal, I believe, I'm sure I'm getting this wrong, that was inhabited by people that could be described as Somali. And they apparently in the 1540s almost crushed the Ethiopian empire of the time. So theoretically, the Somalis could have just wiped out Ethiopia.
This would have been in the north of Somalia, isn't that right?
Well, yes, this would have been in the north of Somalia and in the north of
Djibouti.
Ethiopia, which is sort of where the genesis of what became the Ethiopian empire comes from. The Oromo, the other ethnicities in the south, certainly the Somalis, have often been in opposition to the Ethiopian imperial force. But the Sultanate of Adal almost crushed those Ethiopians in the 1540s until the Portuguese intervened.
Oh, no.
It's just an interesting, because the Ethiopians were actually rumored and hoped for and sought after by Europeans for centuries. They were known as Prester John, this sort of Christian empire on the other side of the world. And the Portuguese were like, well, we found Prester John. We must save them from these Muslims. So they just a sense of just like how deeply interweaved the Ethiopian and Somali history has been with Europe for 500 years, where I often make a point of saying, actually, Europe wasn't that big a deal 500 years ago. But in this case, there was certainly this going on. So one interesting thing to know about Somalia is that it is one of the most ethnically homogenous countries in Africa, if not the world. Tremendously ethnically homogenous, which I think demolishes...
Well, you very rarely hear of anyone moving there, to be fair.
Well, that is true. That is true. I think you hear a lot from certainly right-wing elements in the United States and Europe about how important ethnic homogeneity is, or at least, you let through generations, you let assimilation happen or what have you. Well, I mean, the Somalis are something like 90% of the population of Somalia is 90 to 98%.
Okay.
Depends on what the measure is Somali. And that is not helped them maintain a peaceful and prosperous polity. So that does sort of tend to undermine certain right-wing ideologies.
Also, it's just incredibly harsh landscape. It's just very hard to do any sort of agriculture at all. It does make it just hard. It's hard there seems to be a lot of tribal warfare that goes back and forth. So has there really been much of a Somali state before European intervention, or was it kind of just...
I wanted to bring up the Sultanate of Adal and its great successes against Ethiopia to sort of sweeten the pot a little bit before saying, no, not really. I don't believe there's been a unified... Certainly there have been powerful sultanates, but they're usually rooted in one part of the country or another, and I don't think there really was a unified Somalia. But what's important, I just want to harp on this nationalist thing. The reason I bring up just how ethnically homogenous Somalia is one of the great laments about African countries is that there isn't enough nationalism. There isn't enough fellow feeling between all the different ethnic groups that may call themselves Nigerian, or all the different ethnic groups that may call themselves some other national identity. Whereas Somalia kind of suffers from having too much nationalism.
Okay.
And the key thing here is that Somalis are present. This is even in their flag. If you look at the Somali flag, it is a 5-pointed flag, and each point of that flag represents a Somali population that, in the aspiration of the sort of founders of independent Somalia, that they hoped to all be unified. Unfortunately, 3 of those points are Djibouti, the Somali regions of Ethiopia, and the Somali regions of Kenya. You can sort of see a bit of a problem here. And I think that...
So it's more for the peninsula, the Horn of Africa. This flag seems to symbolize more than Somalia itself.
The Somalis, and certainly the Somalians in the 1960s would have said, no, this is what Somalia should be, and we're going to bring it about. Quick geographical note, the Somali region of Ethiopia may harbor 6% of Ethiopia's population, but it's a huge chunk of the country. I think it's a much larger...
But it's very deserty.
Yeah, but it's a much larger geography than... And it seems like, this was only through Wikipedia, I didn't track this down as much, but it kind of seems like, and this is a really bad dynamic...
Nearly like 40% of the country.
Well, but it seems, and this is moving on, so it seems like, and this is a really bad dynamic that we see in Armenia, actually, where a lot of the founding independence political elites for Armenia came from Nagorno-Karabakh, which is in Azerbaijan, which led to some problems we've discussed at some length. It seemed like the Somali Youth Congress or something, which is sort of the political force around independence in 1960, might have actually had one of its large constituencies in a Somali city in Ethiopia. So it's sort of a shades of other unpleasantness. So we finally get to the late 19th century. And it's worth pointing out that despite this incredibly deep interaction with Europe going back to at least the 1540s, it takes 350 years after that for the Europeans to be powerful enough to really divvy up the Somali territories. So while all of these people are Somali to some extent, and I think it's such a great geographic reach to have the elements of like a homogenous ethnic group, but that's because it's naval. Somalia is the Horn of Africa, and people were able to sail back and forth. They had Islam in common. They had very rich trading networks. So you have Somalis all over the place there. And the way that Italy and Britain, because the territory of modern Somalia was colonized by both the Italians and the British. You have Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland. It's interesting because I was looking for a date as to where this started, and you couldn't really, because how the colonization happened was the British and the Italians would sign protectorate agreements with various little cities and sultanates and this, that, and the other thing. And it's actually quite similar to how South Yemen was colonized. So it's sort of eventually, by the 1890s, both Italy and Britain were trying to consolidate these imperial territories and were inspiring a high degree of resistance. I read about the Dervish movement, which actually managed to actually set up a separate state within Somalia, in parts of both what became British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland from 1904 to 1910, finally crushed by the 1920s. And it seems like really only in the 1920s, the British and the Italians set up sort of unified colonies in these separate parts of Somalia.
It's also a very large country. Like I'm looking at an overlay of it over the United States. It starts from the base of Jacksonville all the way up to New Hampshire, and then the other part, the part that Britain used to own, Somaliland, then goes all the way out to Detroit. So it is a very large place. And when you consider how much of it is very inhospitable, it's not a place. It's definitely a place I would struggle to live in.
It is huge. I'd like to push back a little bit. I think there are a lot of inhospitable regions of Somalia, but...
thought you were going to say of America.
Well, I mean, that's true, actually. Nobody should live in much of Arizona, California, or it's only psychotic in levels of innovation and bravery that have turned those into population centers. I think there also are very green and verdant parts of Somalia as well.
Yeah, in the southern part.
And of course, they have tremendous potential wealth in shipping and trade and what have you.
But also their neighbor has control over their rivers, which is also always worrying.
Yes, not very helpful. So we get to the 1920s, and it does seem there's some consolidation of British and Italian control here. It's important to emphasize that, look, I mean, just thinking about this right now, Somalia's period of independence has unfortunately been dominated by warfare, internal and external. But their time under British and Italian control also seems to have been dominated by warfare, by the Dervish movement, other rebellions, what have you. I think we've got Italy finally consolidated control over all the emirates and whatnot in 1927, and 14 years later, they lost it in World War II.
And then Britain took it again and then gave it back to Italy?
Exactly, and that is an extraordinarily strange thing. I think Wikipedia said this was unique, but it was Wikipedia said this was unique, but I kind of believe it might be unique. It is the only Axis power that was re-awarded territory that had been stripped from it. So between 1951 and 1960, Italy got back Italian Somaliland after a decade. I think the fact that Somalia, a country that had really only been subdued in the 1920s, was not given independence until 1960, with the United Nations at that point, more or less controlled by the United States.
Did Italy not do a lot better with it? Did they not increase literacy and sort of create a lot more industry than Britain, which mostly just used it as like a depot during the war?
Italy didn't have many colonies, so it wouldn't surprise me much if they were more invested in trying to improve the Somali colony that they had. I did not do in-depth research on British or Italian Somaliland. But I do think it's just really worth noting that they weren't allowed independence until 1960, to the point where the UN under the US gave it back to Italy in the 1950s. It's kind of nuts. And I think it pushes back against, it was just a really irritating thing I saw in a What If Alt Hist video, 3 or 4 years ago, where it's like, After World War II, Europe decided that empire was bad and everybody was free very quickly and straightforwardly in the 1940s. It's like, no, that's not actually what happened. Somalia was still a colonial possession of both Britain and Italy 19 years before I was born. So Somalia is a very recently independent country, which I think is worth
But
emphasizing.
it was unprofitable, Rob, so they were doing a kindness to the people.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Ugh, God. We've made it to independence in 1960, and unfortunately a huge emphasis for the people running Somalia at the beginning was getting that other Somali territory. Djibouti actually had a referendum. Djibouti did not become free from France until 1977, 2 years before I was born. And Djibouti had a referendum to see if they wanted to join Somalia, and they chose not to. But it was a real emphasis for the early independence elites in Somalia to really harp on this. We want our territory in these other places back. It's Somali territory, it's Somalia. And I guess being able to unify, so they got independence and instantly unified British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland, becoming the Somalia of today. I guess it's worth doing a bit of a preview, a bit of a flash forward. Most of the territory, I'm not sure if it exactly coincides or not, but the Somaliland, the unacknowledged independent entity of Somaliland today, is mostly British Somaliland, right?
Yeah, for the most part, definitely.
Which should indicate that what happened between 1960 and 1991 was really, really unsatisfying to the British Somalis. In fact, went beyond unsatisfying to being described by some as genocidal, in fact. Anyway, so we're in the early 1960s. We've got a unified Somalia. The next most important thing that happened is the bloodless coup that was carried out by Siad Barre in 1969. This figure, Siad Barre, is quite interesting.
It's considered, before that point, that it was somewhat doing okay and it was kind of democratic. Like, was this kind of the best time for Somalia, it would seem?
I find that I feel like a lot of African countries have like a brief period of democracy and then some dictator comes in. It does seem like it was quite easy, and this is a 9-year period of, it seems like a fair amount disappointment, in part perhaps because these nationalists at the beginning were talking about how they were going to unify all the Somali lands, and they were not doing that. That could have been part of it. Siad Barre was the head of the military, and he pretty much just walked in and took over. I think there was a president or a prime minister that got assassinated in the run-up to that. It seems like there was an election directly prior that perhaps the head of the military did not like. I didn't go into great detail there. Siad Barre, it's kind of interesting. It seems like it got more and more communist as time went on. But I think from the very outset, Somalia was a more communist-oriented country. It was more Soviet-affiliated, which is very interesting and very similar to Yemen. South Yemen was a British colony that ended up, 1967, switching to a full-on communist state. And Siad Barre in Somalia also ended up going fairly... it's interesting. Ended up going fairly far in that direction. I hadn't really never thought about that affinity between sort of communist Somalia
anti-Brits and pro-communism.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting how that worked. But what's strange about Somalia under Siad Barre is that by the end of the Cold War, he was strongly affiliated with the United States, which can be a little hard to understand until you realize that in 1974, Ethiopia ended up having what ended up being a stridently communist revolution that unseated Haile Selassie, the old monarch of Ethiopia, who was traditionally more Western-oriented, as most monarchs were. So Siad Barre, he's running a communist country, but all of a sudden his historic enemies, the Ethiopians, are affiliated with the Soviet Union, which is a little inconvenient for him. And of course, Ethiopia is a much larger country than Somalia. So it's entirely possible that he felt that Ethiopians were getting more support from the Soviets or was jealous or whatnot. For whatever reason, I believe, I didn't a million times check this, but I'm fairly confident that in 1977, it was a Somali choice. I could be wrong about that. Look it up for yourself. It was a Somali choice to launch the Ogaden War.
A lot of sources seem to suggest that, yes.
Yes, that and as we've been talking about, the fact that their mission statement in their flag, the Somali flag, was those parts of Ethiopia belong to us. It's not that surprising that Siad Barre and the Somali government to take this territory that they saw as Somalia. My understanding is that initially Somalia was quite successful and was able to take this largely uninhabited, and when it was inhabited by Somali's region of Ethiopia. The Soviet Union was very angry about this, did not like this.
They thought it was a bad idea from the outset and told them not to do it.
Yes, and was obviously hurting communist solidarity. And this is another one of those, we get another example of that crazy Cold War institution that seems largely forgotten, which was a tremendously competent and successful Cuban expeditionary force. Mengistu, the dictator in charge of Ethiopia, is a famous failure. In the 1980s, Ethiopia became famous for starvation more than anything else. In the waning years of his regime, lost all of Ogaden to Somalia, but was saved by the Cubans, apparently, and Soviet funds. This war ended up being tremendously humiliating for Siad Barre and Somalia.
But I heard even the logistics of it, Somalia just doesn't have the population to occupy this territory, so even in the most basic senses, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no,
they had, 4 million people at the time, so to occupy such a territory with such a population, it just seems like it would have been very difficult.
Well, they would have argued that the population of that territory were Somali. With some support from the Somalis living there. But perhaps you're right, and that it was, even without the Cuban intervention, it was doomed to failure.
Yeah.
But regardless, it failed by 1978.
And a lot of Somali Ethiopians followed them home, I believe, which then put even more pressure on the already waning resources.
That would not surprise me. So you've got 13 years between 1978 and 1991 and the final fall of the Siad Barre regime. The consolation prize that Somalia got was the support of the United States. The United States was perfectly happy to support an invasion of newly communist Ethiopia, and was happy to have an ally in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia remained communist until the end of the Cold War, so Somalia was a useful ally, and that's probably the only thing that kept this failed, and it seems like quite loathsome regime of Siad Barre going. I say loathsome specifically of something I learned about this morning and did not put enough detail into, but apparently we have something in the 1980s described as the Isak genocide. This is a particular subset of Somalis, a clan perhaps, based in, what I believe is now the capital of the semi-independent state of Somaliland. I've seen figures like 50,000 people killed, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Obviously, there's always disputes over these numbers. But it seems like it's really, really dark, and apparently involved destroying much of the city of, Hargeisa? Yeah, which I'm sure I've mispronounced. So even though the sort of Somali civil war proper doesn't is mostly marked by most as starting in 1991, it's clear that after the loss of the Ogaden War, which of course ended up wiping out a lot of Somali military resources and military personnel, and also disillusioning folks. Siad Barre was incredibly popular for those months where it seemed like he'd managed to put together the third point on the Somali flag. And when it turned out that had not happened, things...
It kind of looks like if you cross the Vietnamese flag with the UN flag.
Yeah, it's got that pleasing blue. With
a white star in the center.
Yeah. Things started really, really falling apart. Siad Barre ended up building a lot of really nasty prisons that were eventually taken over.
Here's me optimistically thinking you're going to say roads.
No, no. It does seem like there's some sense that in his early period in power, 1969 through the end of the 70s, the loss of the Aganan War, he seems to have built a lot of infrastructure. He seems to have really helped literacy, what have you. But Siad Barre in the 1980s seems to have been pretty dark. Ended up building a bunch of prisons that were then taken over by U.S. Special Forces for their torture, rendition, and varieties of nasty detention. A little bit of foreshadowing there. Somalia is falling apart across the 1980s. The only thing keeping it going is U.S. funding of Siad Barre. I think rightly should have happened earlier, probably. The United States, with the end of the Cold War, becomes a lot less interested in funding the quite awful and genocidal regime of Siad Barre. Support is withdrawn. His government falls very quickly. 1991, history heads will know, is sort of a pretty pivotal year in the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, it does seem like basically, well, we don't care about communism anymore, so screw you.
Pretty much.
Wow.
And this is the same dynamic in the Congo. The Congo was run for not all of, but most of the Cold War. I think Lumumba was assassinated in 1960, and pretty much Mobutu Sese Seko was in charge of the Congo, then known as Zaire, from 1960 until the early 1990s. And that was incredibly mismanaged CIA, U.S. government-supported dictator. And the Congo has not really been able to bounce back from our pulling out our funding of that dictator. That doesn't mean that it was a bad thing to stop funding these dictators. I think that in the long run, it is good that we were no longer funding horrific dictatorial. Unfortunately, neither the Congo nor Somalia seems to have been able to really put it together since. I'm not that angry at the first Bush for pulling out funding of the Somali government. I think that, well, it was definitely a bad idea. I think you can see why the first Bush, this is the guy who was president from 1989 to 1993, decided to launch a humanitarian expedition in Somalia. He could see that the ending of U.S. funding had basically destroyed the country, and he felt bad about it, and he wanted to put things back together. And he was riding high off of his victory in the first Gulf War, kicking Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I think he was not quite as maliciously as the neocon fail nerds that succeeded him, but was looking for ways to demonstrate the utility and show the utility of U.S. power and show the virtue of U.S. leadership. So he sent military forces into Somalia. And I think most people who listen to this podcast will know what happened since. It was memorialized in a quite gripping film by Ridley Scott called Black Hawk Down. A variety of U.S. Special Forces folks became trapped, I think in at least one, maybe two downed helicopters in Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And I think 19 U.S. service members were killed in a horrific battle that may have killed 800 to 1,000 Somalis. And that was quite humiliating and was not something that Bill Clinton, who had taken power at that point, really wanted to deal with. So the United States just left. I saw an interesting thing. Between 1991 and 2018, there was no U.S. embassy in Somalia. And across the 1990s, I think it was 93 or 94 was when the United States pulled out. Somalia just fell further and further into chaos. And you know what? I think that's all very sad, but I don't think the United States could have done more or better at this point.
It is just such a big region with, you'll have clans within clans all vying for power. Mm-hmm. And there also seems to be the other thing, instead of people seeing themselves as part of this larger peninsula, they'll not really consider themselves Somali at all. It's just about your small region and, striving for power within it. So I don't know what you could have done in that period. It just seems terrifying.
Certainly there should have been, more humanitarian stuff. There should have been broader diplomatic efforts.
I'm always reminded of, sadly, Live Aid, the UK one. It wasn't Somalia, but basically they give a load of food over, and that just meant the government used that to like lure other people out. It's like, oh, look at all this lovely food. So once they left, they stole their land. So quite often when you try to help, you can just make things worse. It's just a nightmare.
Was Libid, was that Ethiopia or?
I think that was Ethiopia. Yeah.
I'm not, because it'd be impossible for me to say that there's nothing that the U.S. could have done better here. But honestly, certainly compared to what we're about to discuss, I don't really blame George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton for what happened to Somalia. There are plenty of things that I blame those guys for, but I don't think Somalia is on them. Somalia, however, is very much on George W. Bush. What happened there is perhaps one of the most humiliating experiences for the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence community, which is why we never, ever talk about it. And hopefully this was illustrated in great detail in this book, Dirty Wars by Jeremy Scahill, among many other places, but this is the account that I'm most wrapped up in. So 2001, we have 9/11. We have the Bush administration is incredibly interested in going after Islamic militants. Somalia is a Muslim country that is largely ungoverned. So absolutely, Al-Qaeda was looking for ways and had folks there looking to set up training camps, resources, what have you. The United States decided we needed to be in there. They may not even have been wrong about that, but the way they did it was so bad that it ended up changing the country dramatically and honestly, debatably positively, but in a way that the Bush administration didn't like, so we went in and destroyed that too. So we had a number of warlords who had power throughout Mogadishu and throughout the country. And what happened in the direct aftermath of 9/11 was the United States decided to start funding those warlords. Keep in mind, these are drug dealers. These are human traffickers. These are just really nasty people. They are, in fact, the nasty people that killed those U.S. Special Forces back in the mid-90s. But we decided we had to go after Al-Qaeda. So we worked with these guys. We actually built up these guys and carried out a program of targeted assassination, but it was the Somali warlords that were our sort of special forces of the time. This got really, really dark, really, really quick, and empowering, referred to in multiple sources as the sort of CIA warlords.
Wow.
Actually ended up backfiring against U.S. interests, but actually working out rather well for Somalia. These warlords were a nasty bunch who people were getting very, very sick of before 2001. But the sort of jacked up brutality and mass murder that they were capable of with all the U.S. intelligence community resources made the Somali people kind of rise up in an interesting way. It's actually, there's some affinities here with how the Taliban rose in Afghanistan in the aftermath of a horrific civil war between the forces that the U.S. had supported against the Soviets. A series of Islamic courts were set up throughout the country that essentially were able to locally create forces that pushed out the warlords. And at first, starting out small, but by 2005 and 2006, they were actually able to bring peace to Mogadishu for the first time in at least 15 years, if not longer. And the Islamic Courts Union, under a guy named Sharif Sheikh Ahmed, had control. I don't think they had control of Somaliland or Puntland. I'm not entirely sure on that. I had difficulty finding the details on that. But they had control of Mogadishu and its environs, which is a lot of population. Were able to open the airport, were able to open ports. It was honestly, this is the only period, you had asked earlier about a golden age. This is the only period of Somali history that I've seen described anywhere as something like a golden age. Because truly, the Somali people got sick of what these warlords had been doing to them and decided to sort of unify, but in a somewhat federal way. It was an Islamic courts union. Each region or area or neighborhood had its sort of source of power. And it really looked like Somalia had begun to heal itself. And the Bush administration hated everything about it because the Islamic courts union had the name Islamic in it.
Well, it is very scary.
Yeah, Islam is scary. And the fact that Islam had brought peace to Somalia was unacceptable to the Bush administration. To be fair, there absolutely were, in small factions, there was some influence of Al-Qaeda. There were some connections, but this was not under Sharif Sheikh Ahmed, the Islamic Courts Union was not an institution that was talking about attacking the United States. It was not talking about extremism. It was talking about certainly Sharia, because it's a Muslim country. And I think even communist Siad Barre was trying to find ways to incorporate that Muslim history. But, it just wanted peace and orderliness and was eager to work with the United States. What the United States did was make a deal with Ethiopia, Somalia's historic enemy, to invade Somalia and crush the Islamic Courts Union. By this point, the sort of U.S. Special Forces nightmare force was really kicking into high gear. So not only was Ethiopia invading the country, but the whole galaxy of special forces that we were talking about in the last episode was running around assassinating anybody that had any relation to Al-Qaeda or this tiny little splinter group called Al-Shabaab, and anybody that was connected to the Islamic Courts Union, which was the entity that had brought peace and unity to Somalia for the first time in 15 years, which obviously made Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab very popular. So this Islamist anti-U.S. faction that was not a very serious part of the Islamic Courts Union then became incredibly important and started taking significant chunks of Somalia. So by putting in I think by the Obama administration, we'd realized what a colossal failure this was, how we had created tremendous resentment by using their historic enemy, Ethiopia, by destroying the entity that had brought peace to the place. So there was a shift in focus. Ethiopia was shuffled out. A multilateral African, AMISOM it's called, multilateral force of African countries moved in. Incredibly, the transitional federal government of Somalia, the first president of the transitional federal government after the Ethiopians had been switched out, was Sharif Sheikh Ahmed. So essentially we had gone to war to destroy the Islamic Courts Union and had realized we had done such a crappy job that we brought the head of the Islamic Courts Union back to run Somalia. And it seems like he did a decent enough job, though of course not a decent enough job to fully bring back stability to Somalia. And we're now 17 years later, 18 years later, we finally, through tremendous expenditure by the United States, by the African Union, and tremendous loss of life and destruction, we've gotten to a point of peace in Somalia that is not as good as what the Islamic Courts Union had established in 2006.
Are things getting slightly better? Just when I was researching, there seemed to be this emphasis. They were claiming that, isn't it great the Americans are helping? They're able to, when the enemy used to attack, they used to get defeated. Now they're able to bring the fight to the enemy. I'm also seeing that they've paid off a lot of their debt.
Well, it's not that they paid it off, it's that they got debt relief.
Oh, they got debt relief. So yeah, the statistics I have is what paid off 90% of their foreign debt, 60% of their GDP was debt in 2018, and now only 6%.
So Al-Shabaab in 2013, Al-Shabaab was pushed out of Mogadishu. There have been periods where you can say the Ethiopian government has almost won or almost lost or this, that, and the other thing. But I think that Al-Shabaab has been kept out of Mogadishu since 2013. The battle in rural areas goes back and forth. Since 2013, Al-Shabaab seems to be more focused on carrying out international terrorism than on controlling territory. So yippee. They are still powerful. They are still there. I think in 2022, one source I was reading was talking about an Al-Shabaab resurgence where they've still got 7,000 to 18,000 fighters working for them. So yes, I think it is true that Somalia is finally able to consolidate in a lot of ways, but I think it's also true that it was in better shape in 2006 before the Bush administration invaded with Ethiopia. And debt relief is very important. There is a established program, I don't know if it's through the United Nations or the IMF, but there is an established program where countries that are impoverished and have obscene amounts of debt can jump through a number of hoops to achieve a certain level of debt relief. And it is absolutely an indication that to some degree, Somalia has gotten to a point where they have enough administrative capacity to jump through enough of those hoops to achieve debt relief. And that's great. Don't get me wrong, that's great. But in 2006, they had already achieved a higher degree of peace and consolidation. In 2006, who knows, maybe they could have convinced Somaliland to stick around. But because of this additional 2 decades of destruction brought about by incredibly poor George W. Bush administration choices in 2006, Somalia is now having to deal with an Ethiopia that's turning Somaliland into a client that is, they're that much further into climate change. Somalia is a tremendous victim of weather effects, weather events, whether you believe in climate change or not. Yeah, it's just incredible lost decades for a country that couldn't really afford it.
Can you see much chance of Somaliland getting recognized as an actual country?
It's interesting. Before I'd read about the Isaaq genocide, I was kind of pretty firmly opposed to that idea. I'm still, man, this is I was talking about this.
So I think the only country that recognizes it is Taiwan.
Oh, interesting. In return for being recognized.
Yes.
Yes. I was talking about this at a house party in New York, which rarely happens recently, but I managed to luck into a person who works fairly closely on these issues. And it's just changing borders is always a bad idea. It does seem like in the Somaliland's case, they've kind of had their own borders for a while. So that's kind of a different thing. But
there is some historic precedent for it as well, with ancient empires ruling around that area, but that also included Djibouti.
Well, also British Somaliland,
I
think
exactly.
is the most direct precedent for Somaliland's independence. Generally, I do have a a generalized prejudice against changing borders, but it may be a fait accompli. It may be, if Somaliland this was a recent, I think it was just the beginning of this year, where Somaliland and Ethiopia signed, I don't think it was the first deal, but a more serious deal on military cooperation or the use of a port. And it does seem that if Somaliland is eager to work with Ethiopia, there may not be much that Somalia can do about it. If you want to see who's most responsible for what a Somali nationalist would describe as the dismemberment of Somalia, that would be George W. Bush.
So one of many countries that he destroyed?
Yeah, for sure. I guess to close on it does appear that after really, it's not just 30 years, because the 1980s under Siad Barre seem to have been pretty bleak as well. So 45 years of war and destruction. Somalia is finally able to crawl back to a position that is as good or better, probably not better, but might be as good as where they were in 2006 before Bush destroyed it. And we should all hope and pray that they can continue to move forward and continue to improve and go onward and upward. Being able to qualify for debt relief is a very good sign. I think they had a president, and I seem to remember they had a president a couple of years back who tried to hold on to power longer than he should have, and he was shuffled off to some degree peacefully, I believe. These are really great signs, but it is still a tremendously damaged and at-risk country. But hopefully now you know a little bit more about it.
Do you think you'll be going to Minnesota to visit America's largest Somali population? They think about 1% of Minnesota's population is Somalia?
I have a lot of family in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So yeah, something to contemplate, something to think about. I've never been there. I don't think,
Okay.
at least not for decades.
So it's one country that might have a positive outlook?
I mean, a lot of things got to go right.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things got to go right,
And hopefully Trump doesn't get in, because it's one of those things he could just throw a few special forces about, and before we know it, it's as bad as ever.
as bad as ever. Indeed, one also, they're not being helped by the Red Sea being shut down.
No.
That's not great. That is not great for Somalia either. So, yeah, it does seem like one of the most important dynamics is war fatigue. I was always incredibly impressed, remain incredibly impressed with Lebanon managing to, despite having, I think, taking in like 30% of their population as refugees from the Syrian war, just adamantly refusing to fall into the same conflict, despite having all the same factions that they have in Syria, mostly because they'd done 15 years of brutal civil war between 1975 and 1990 and just weren't interested. And perhaps enough Somali elements have reached that point that perhaps that's the most hopeful thing I can say about Somalia, and that might be hope enough.
So hopefully a place you'll be investing in and visiting in the future.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.